legislators because they understand the impact that the proposals will have on their particular constituents. But again, we don't think that people are saying enough about this. The governor has hidden a lot of these proposals in the budget, as you know. They should not be in the budget. They should be in a form so that a different form so that the community can understand what they are, be involved in giving their particular opinions, lobby against a certain pieces of this legislation. But once you put it in the budget, it sort of gets hidden to a great extent, and it doesn't get the kind of public airing that I think a separate piece of legislation might get.
You said a minute ago that there might be some other ways, more effective ways to deal with juvenile offenders, other than the way the governor's proposed. What would be one or two of your ideas about that?
Well, the first thing that I think we need to pay attention to is prevention. And the governor in his budget proposes cutting a crime prevention program for young people. So I think that's the first problem. With juvenile offenders, I certainly think that we need to be able to use experts who can work very closely with young people, getting communities involved in that whole process. Not everyone, I think, has to go to prison in order to be rehabilitated, because I don't think anybody's rehabilitated in prison. But I think communities need to be much more involved in dealing with those who break the law in their communities.
And how does that happen? What's the framework that you'd set up to allow communities or to enable communities to be more involved with these kids?
Well, we've been exploring an idea of that deals with community corrections, which would allow a body of citizens to be much more involved in making decisions about what should happen to young people. And I think that would be a way of setting up a structure that would allow the courts to have that kind of input from the community so that they could be involved in that whole process. Just taking young people and putting them into a secure facility in DFY or in prison is not going to help. But we need to be putting more resources into addressing the problems of young people. And that's something that, of course, is difficult because no one wants to spend money on poor kids. And they would feel more comfortable putting them in prison where they're going to be spending the money anyways, because we're spending something like $80,000 a year for each child. But if we had a concentrated program of education and counseling with community involvement, I think that we probably would see better results and save a whole generation of young people rather than putting them in prisons where they probably are going to become involved in crime again at a later stage of their lives.
When you make this case to legislators of all parties, what response do you get? What do they tell you?
Well, I think legislators, to a great extent, are always want to appear tough on crime. And right now, the way to do it, because all statistics say that crime among juveniles has increased, violent crime among juveniles has increased, they're reluctant to think about doing something a different kind of way. For instance, so many of them talk about the problem of guns in the schools. And when we talk about the fact that maybe one of the reasons that guns are in the schools is because they're in the communities, so that you have to deal with the problem in the community as well. They don't like to talk about things like that. They want to focus in on the young people and say that, that we really need to be dealing with them, harsher sentences, because this sounds good. And politicians, unfortunately, are about being reelected, and you don't want to appear soft on crime.
I have to stop you there for now. But thanks very much for being with us today, Dr. Green. Dr. Alice Green is Executive Director of the Center for Law and Justice in Albany, and she was our guest tonight on Q&A, and we hope we can have her back soon to talk about the media and some other issues as well. Until then, I'm Michael Carisse. Thanks very much for joining us, and good night.
There's a new study out suggesting minorities are more likely to get jail time for offenses than whites. Governor Pataki has rejected the conclusion that the justice system is biased. His criminal justice director says the judicial system reflects socioeconomic status, not race. Well, with us tonight is a woman who has worked for over a decade with prison inmates, Alice Green of the Center for Law and Justice. Alice, welcome back. Good to see you again.
Yes, thank you.
So is the justice system reflecting the realities, as one judge said, that the poor, the underprivileged, or is it racially biased?
Well, I think certainly the system is racially biased. However, economics might play a role in some crime. The study that was released the other day is only one of many studies that have indicated that race plays a major factor in the criminal justice system. I think also if we look at the numbers of people who are actually arrested for crimes, we'll find that whites are actually arrested much more often than people of color, yet people of color tend to be the ones who are sentenced to prison.
Well, currently about 80% of our
As a matter of fact,
system.
right now in New York State, 85% of the prison system is made up of African Americans and Latinos. So I think.
But isn't it possible that that's because economic deprivation causes people from some sense of desperation and hopelessness to commit crimes that are more easily solved?
Right. I don't think anyone would deny that economics plays a role. However, poor people perhaps commit property offenses more than middle-class whites.
Sure.
But middle-class whites commit different kinds of crimes that are much more difficult to detect.
But you believe if, say, a burglary, a white man and a black man stand before the judge, you think there's a very real chance that black man will go to prison and the white man won't?
Absolutely. This is what the study shows. What they did was look at persons who were very similar, same kind of crime, same kind of background
Right.
in terms of criminal behavior, and found that more often African Americans were sentenced to prison terms when they could have been placed on probation as whites were.
The governor's staff says, no. That study is flawed because the study, while it did look at crimes, did not look at work history and probation reports and other things that are factored into a judge's decision. Do you agree?
Well, it's interesting that at first they did consider the study to be very sophisticated. And if it's true that economics plays a role, then the Pataki administration should not be cutting out monies that would go to assist people with legal services. So I think that's a real problem for the administration to explain that.
Assume for a minute that it's not as much economics as plain racial bias. What do we do about that? How can you ever cure that problem?
Well, I think first of all, we should look at it rather than proposing sentences that would increase the length of time that people would be incarcerated or cut out parole, that type of thing, which Pataki is actually recommending right now.
But how do you reach the judge sitting on the bench about to sentence a felon who may be more inclined, if you're right, to sentence the black felon the longer time than the white felon? How do you reach him?
Well, some legislators are proposing that we work with judges to make them more sensitive to this issue of racism that's involved in the criminal justice system. That's already been proposed, and hopefully that's something that we could work with.
Well, you've been at this for a long time. Have you talked to area judges? Can you get in to see them to talk about this sort of thing, and how do they react?
Well, some judges are more open than others, and some judges will not admit that race plays a factor. But I think we have enough evidence and documentation in the number of studies that have been done around the country to suggest that race is a factor in sentencing and in other parts of the system.
Are there judges locally, and you can name names or not, it's up to you, but are there judges locally that you would tell a minority, someone is accused and who is also a member of a minority, try to get before this judge and not this one?
I think there have been judges, and I won't mention any names, but there have been judges, particularly in Albany County, that have been seen as biased by members of the African American community and other communities. And certainly you would like not to be a part of
Are they still
court.
on the bench today?
I really would rather not say.
I'm obviously not going to pin Alice Green down, but thank you for joining us tonight. Dr. Alice Green. We'll be back, update everything at 11. See you tomorrow night at 10 o'clock. Our guest then, Tom Kelly, the discussion politics. Good night.
welcome to Q&A. I'm Michael Carisse, and tonight we're coming to you from the office of Dr. Alice Green, who is Executive Director of the Center for Law and Justice in Albany. She's a well-known civil rights activist in our area and joined us on an earlier program to critique the Pataki administration's budget, particularly as it pertained to criminal justice policy. Tonight we've asked her back to talk about the media and how it handles issues like criminal justice and the African-American community. And thanks for having us again.
Thank you.
I want to start by talking about an article that you wrote for the Times-Union newspaper in Albany recently about an incident during the King Day celebration at the Capitol in which you confronted the Lieutenant Governor, Betsy McCoy Ross. And why don't you, for people who may not have read that article, why don't you summarize what your points were about how the media and the political establishment deals with Martin Luther King Day?
Well, I raised a couple of questions, and one was who actually controls the image and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. And I certainly theorize that it's more of the white power structure that does it for their own purposes. One is basically to control African Americans and those who appear to threaten in any way the social structure that exists in this country. And then the other point I tried to make was that people who are powerless find it very difficult for those in power to listen to their concerns in such a way that the power structure will humanely respond to the needs of poor people, people of color. And I also suggested that the media often reports on this in a very dispassionate kind of way, and have absolutely no role to play in terms of making sure that everyone becomes educated about what certain groups' needs are, that they just simply play a role in terms of reporting it without having any real concern about what it is that they're reporting.
Yeah, now that's a tricky question, as you know,
Yes.
because journalists will tell you that the further they move away from neutrality or dispassion, you get into some very gray areas about advocacy and objectivity and so forth. If you were a journalist, how would you handle that?
Well,
I mean,
the
how would you avoid
assumption-
those difficulties?
Yeah, the assumption is that the media reports in an objective fashion, and I certainly can't subscribe to that, because they come from a perspective, and so whatever they do it, and they're also controlled by the power structure, more or less, and so what they do is try to report in a way that puts that power structure in a more favorable light, and does not report those who are powerless really sort of get left out of the equation in terms of actually having the media objectively, as much as possible, report the issues of concern to them.
Well, give me an example of that, a particular issue that you think is mishandled by the media.
Well, I certainly think that if we go again to criminal justice, I think it's a perfect example. I've contacted the media in the past regarding their reporting of crime, and sometimes the way they stereotype certain groups in our society, particularly African Americans and Latinos. For example, I contacted one of our local stations not too long ago because when they reported on an incident, it was drug related and there was a murder, and there was no suspect. I mean, they had the person already in custody, so they weren't looking for someone or anything like that, and they reported the race of this particular person, and was making some suggestion that this person, appeared to be guilty. I thought that was totally inappropriate to do. There was no reason for reporting, first of all, the race of that person.
And you don't think if it had been a white suspect that they would have said
Right, they wouldn't have
were
said
white.
this is, this is a white suspect or anything like that. And so I asked them why they felt the need to do that. And they said that their policy is that they will report whatever the police give them, but would indicate that that's the way the police department had actually described the person. But when they reviewed their tape, they found out that they had indeed simply referred to this person's race and not attributed to the police department or anything, and they admitted they were wrong. But that happens a lot, that we use race or that we look at a certain group, for instance, as victims. Most of the material that I've seen in the media around victims, for instance, are usually portray whites as victims. When you look at statistics, you'll find that most of the people who are victimized happen to be people of color. But it's not unusual at all to see a white person being portrayed in that kind of way. Look at Megan's Law, for instance, is another example of how this policy gets, how the media coverage gets translated into policy.
And this is a law that would allow people to find out if there's...
sex offender
right.
identification.